Hi folks, I'm Father Joe Grimaldi. You can call me Joe, and I'd like to welcome you to my podcast. But now, here's our host and friend, Ken Calvert.
All right, so Father Joe Grimaldi, adding to your chores, added another church. He's supposed to be retired, yet he continues to just work his proverbial tail off, and we thank you for that, Father. Father Joe Grimaldi, the podcast. I noticed that on January 28th, it was the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas, who is the patron saint of colleges and college students, a philosopher revered by many. Are you a fan?
Well, definitely. I mean, how could you not be? I do not rise to the level of his, how shall I say it, his sense of theology, his sense of philosophy, and so on. But he's a fascinating individual. You know that his teacher, St. Albert the Great, Albertus Magnus, just looked at him and he would call him the dumb ox, okay? And that was because he was so big and he was just enormous size-wise, and he just kept writing. And one of the things that fascinates me, after he wrote the Summa, he was at the very end, and his assistant supposedly was there helping him, and Thomas stops, and he says, and of course the assistant was asking him to continue, but he just stopped, and he said, this was towards the end of his life, and he just said, after all that I have said in his writings, he said, I feel that this is nothing but a bunch of straw. You know, the assistant couldn't understand what he was saying. If you read a little bit further on that kind of thing, you'll see that he was having some sort of a mystical experience. And he felt that everything that he had written down to try to explain in mere words the whole sense of creation and God and humanity and so on and so forth, he felt that that is nothing by comparison to the vision that was awaiting him at the end of his life. And so he said, this is nothing but straw. And if you look at the Summa Theologica, it's something that's revered by almost every theologian since the 13th century and so on. Now, Thomas certainly had some heavy-duty people to rely on. When you consider St. Augustine, who was a very prolific writer around the 4th century, you look at Augustine of Hippo, of northern Africa is where he was from, but he was a prolific writer. For someone in the 4th century, his writings are still very much esteemed today. There's no question. Inevitably, Thomas relied on those. And then take a non-Catholic, if you want, the Greek Aristotle. That had to influence him as well in philosophy. But you mentioned Thomas. From what I know, Thomas is the theologian. He's the philosopher in the Catholic Church. I mean, everybody is familiar, not everybody, but those who are into this kind of thing are familiar with Thomistic philosophy and Thomistic theology. But also beyond that, he was known for his common sense. There was no question about that. And so that he was excellent in the way he relayed jurisprudence. So he was a master at the law as well. And I think what always fascinates me, having someone like that in the 13th century, being able to be so able to and use his expertise in such a beautiful way that he's so well understood by theologians today, and so on and so forth. Not everybody agrees with his philosophy, with his theology, but they certainly know it before they disagree with it.
Why would they disagree with it?
Very often he tends to be too rigid, and so that maybe many of the theologians would not necessarily agree with him. However, I'm stymied at that.
There's something I read that described him as being able to beautifully combine the principles of theology with the philosophical principles of reason. He ranked among the most influential of thinkers. How important is it to simply be a thinker when it comes to delving into theology? Am I asking the right question?
Yeah, and I think you stated it very nicely, too. So,
What does it mean, in quotes, a thinker? In other words, we're all thinkers, but what does he do, Joe, that separates him from us?
I can't describe each one, but there are 5 reasons for God's existence that Thomas came up with. And those are studied by all theologians, as far as I know, by seminarians. And there are 5 ways he tells us that there is a God. And he does it in such a way that the layman could understand. You know, the Archdiocese of Detroit, the Archbishop is putting into effect something called Unleash the Gospel. And basically, and in my simplistic mind, basically what I think that is take theology, take what we know as church, and try to make it accessible and interesting to the ordinary layfolk. So in other words, just as Thomas was able to put theology into reason, I think this might be a way of doing something similar, taking what we believe as Catholics and unleashing the gospel to the ordinary folks.
As the patron saint of students, it's confusing to me when I think about the various things, the various tenets of the church. It really is. When I think about how important was St. Thomas Aquinas, did St. Thomas Aquinas, what I'm trying to say, Joe, is this, that the people that followed him, would they be considered students which we can now take to this particular element of our lives today?
I would suspect that all of the major theologians that try to interpret things like in the Vatican Council II, Vatican Council I, these things, they had to rely heavily on Thomas Aquinas because he was the authority. I mean, as far as the Middle Ages are concerned, there's no greater mind.
Why was he considered the authority?
Well, I think University of Paris, you speak about Rome, you speak about the Pope, and so on. All of them all had him in high regard because of his writings being so understandable, if you want, so that it wasn't just this theology that's over people's heads, but he was able to explain it in such a way that the theologians could make heads and tails out of it, okay? They just didn't, it wasn't something you just can't grasp at. But he himself didn't think that he had done such wonderful things. It's just that it's interesting, as he says, what I've done so far is nothing compared to what awaits.
Is there something in the high school or college level that people may say, I direct your attention to this particular part of St. Thomas Aquinas' preaching or teaching?
Yeah, it wouldn't be preaching so much as teaching, I think. He was a writer, and therefore his works were well known, particularly in the Middle Ages. He was the philosopher of the times.
How do you direct me to investigate St. Thomas Aquinas? Where would I start?
I'm not afraid to show people the road, okay? What I can't do, there are people that can. First of all, I would do a little bit of research to find out who is knowledgeable, but also who is able to express what he knows or she knows, and then direct you to that person, and so that you can converse with that person to find out more about. Short of taking classes on Thomas Aquinas, I don't know of any other way except finding the knowledgeable individual who's able to express those thoughts in such a way that others can understand.
How is it that he became the standard bearer for so many names on high schools and colleges?
Well, because as patron of the student, if you want. The dumb ox certainly knew what he was talking about. This is Father Joe Grimaldi, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Father Joe Podcast.